Charity isn't just about helping people who are down, it's about creating social fabric. The state is quite the opposite of society. It's all coercion rather than
Right.
collaboration and voluntary persuasion.
I am a husband, a father, a lawyer, a Christian, and a proud Canadian. I started this series because it was clear that our nation needs truth. Not just another biased narrative, but real information of substance. We need access to facts and the freedom to think for ourselves. I'm Leighton Grey, and this is Grey Matter.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Grey Matter. Today, I am delighted to have on the program Connor Boyack. He is an author of 39 books, including the popular Tuttle Twins children's series. He's a founder and president of the Libertas Institute, a high-impact think tank. He's executive producer of the Tuttle Twins show, and he's an investor in a few high-impact startups, and he's also an outlaw beekeeper. I've been reading his several of his books with interest that we're going to talk about today. Connor, thanks very much for being our special guest on Grey Matter today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, it's my pleasure. As I said, I've read now 3 of your books. The one, Feardom, which was just excellent. Also, Christ versus Caesar, and your first book in a 2-part series on Christian liberty, which I really enjoyed. I think it was one of your earlier books, and so I want to talk about those and feature those. But before we do that, just to frame our discussion, I've got a couple of aphorisms. I know you're fond of these from reading your books. The first one is from Joseph Fielding Smith. This is from Doctrines of Salvation, Volume 3. And he said something I think is very prescient. I think you'll agree, Connor. He wrote, "Satan has control now. No matter where you look, he's in control. Even in our own land, he's guiding the governments as far as the Lord will permit him. That is why there's so much strife, turmoil, and confusion all over the earth. One mastermind is governing the nations, and it is Satan himself." The other one the aphorism I want to sort of frame our discussion with is from someone whom you've quoted often in your books, and that's C.S. Lewis. Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. And then finally, one more from an author that you quote from, I guess more than an author, really a founding father of liberty, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote that rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. So, Connor, on your website, you state that liberty won't defend itself. Is that part of the impetus for the Libertas project? That is to sort of put this idea of liberty into action. I just want to add something else. I don't know if you're familiar with Eric Metaxas and his books. He's a recent guest in our program, and he's written a wonderful book called The Letter to the American Church. And the theme of the book is that it's a call to action, saying that it's not enough just to go to church and to call ourselves Christians and to be nice. Now, what we're living through right now, perhaps we have been living through for a very long time, for over 2,000 years, is a time in which we've got to take our faith into action. Is that part of what this Libertas project is for you?
Yeah, not so much on the religious side, but definitely on the political and freedom side. Libertas is what's called a think tank. It means we're an NGO or a nonprofit organization, and our chief focus is basically standing up for people who can't or won't stand up for themselves. If you're a large corporation and there's some regulation that threatens your business or the ability to serve your customers, chances are you can afford lobbyists and lawyers and go fight for your rights. And that's very common. It happens all the time. But the average citizen who's being nickeled and dimed with tax increases, or whose tiny little business is being overregulated, or parents in a low-income community where the schools are just doing an awful job and they want better options for their kids, these types of people historically have never really had good representation. They've never had people standing up for them. And so we started in my now adopted home state of Utah. I'm from California. I like to tell people I left back in the days when you could find a U-Haul truck to leave, and now that's difficult to find anymore, unless you pay a premium. So I live in Utah now, and I started Libertas in 2011 with the intent to try and stand up for people's rights and push back on government growth and restrictive laws and so forth. We've now since expanded across the country, helping other states do the same thing. I would point your listeners to a website called spn.org. This
Mhm.
stands for State Policy Network. We are a member of this. They're a national organization of freedom-minded think tanks like Libertas. And
Right.
so, for those who live in the United States, I should say, then SPN is a way where you can find who's in your backyard. For any of your viewers who are in other countries, there's a great organization called Atlas Network. That's atlasnetwork.org. And so on either of these websites, spn.org or atlasnetwork.org, you can go look at the directory and you can see which organizations are operating in your state, your country, your backyard, so that you can go support them, learn from them, work with them, volunteer. They're just good opportunities to figure out who's in your community working on these issues and go support them because they need support.
So I want to turn from there to talking about your really prolific authorship of children's books and the Tuttle Twins series. How did you get started with that, and what's the genesis of that idea, and what's the goal of this very, very successful Tuttle Twins series?
So, as you point out, these books are primarily for children. That's at least how we what we thought when we first started. We've since come to realize that the Tuttle Twins books are instead what we now call family resources, because while they're written at a children's level for the kids, quite often mom and dad never learned this stuff in school, or certainly not in a way that we're explaining it that's super simple and relevant. So we get comments from parents all the time saying, "Oh my gosh, I never learned that before," or "This finally made sense. It never made sense before." So these are more family resources. And it all started because myself as a father, years ago, after starting Libertas Institute and working on reforming these laws and helping people, I realized that I wanted to share with my kids what dad does all day for work. And I didn't want to say, "Oh, I just talk to people on the phone," or "I go to meetings," or "I, type on the computer." I wanted to share with them the substantive ideas of what I'm passionate about and what I fight for. So I literally went on Amazon. I looked for books that would help me talk to my kids about, property rights or free markets or money and so forth, and just came up short. There was really, this is in 2014. So I was talking with a buddy of mine, Elijah, who's now the illustrator and my partner in this project. And he had kids the same age. He was wanting the same goals. And so we kind of, kicked around this idea. We did a book. We had no idea if it would succeed. We didn't know if anyone else would care, but we wanted it to exist. So we willed it into existence, and turns out a lot of people, liked it. And they said, "When are you doing another one?" I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
"Oh, okay, we'll do another one." So it just kind of snowballed from there. Now we've got, 25 to 30 books for toddlers, teens, every age in between. We've got curriculum, a podcast, a game, a cartoon, and we're just really trying to build out a lot of content so that no matter the age of a child or how they like to learn, whether it's viewing something or like doing a worksheet or reading a book, we want to make sure we have content for kids of all ages and learning styles so that these ideas of human flourishing and a free society are accessible to them, and that we can support every family in having far more meaningful conversations around the dinner table that are facilitated hopefully by the Tuttle Twins.
Mm-hmm. I take it that part of this, Connor, is a reaction to some of the things that are being taught in schools today, things like critical race theory, things like radical transgenders, and things like toxic masculinity. There's nothing in the schools about financial literacy. In fact, there wasn't even when I went to school. And it seems to me that that should be sort of number one with a bullet, the number one thing kids should be learning nowadays.
You would
So,
think.
yes, you would think, if we thought, yes. Um, and so is part of the goal of the Tuttle Twin series to give parents tools so that they can counteract what these kids are getting in public school? Or do you advocate, homeschooling and taking kids right out of public school?
Well, our audience is split right down the middle when we've done surveys. About half of them homeschool, and the other half are in public or private or charter school. And so for the parents who homeschool, clearly this can be used as, curriculum to teach civics or history or economics. And many homeschool families use our materials that way. For the families where their kids are going to school, our resources are primarily used by those families as a supplement, or I might even say as a counter agent, because those families know, as you just pointed out, that not only are their kids not being taught the good stuff in school, their heads are being filled with a bunch of bad stuff. And
Hmm.
so these families at home have resources now with the Tuttle Twins to kind of undo some of the stuff that they may have been taught in school, or at least support them with good ideas and truth to empower them as they go out into the world and are exposed to different ideas from their teachers. So they're really adaptable in that way. Personally, I do advocate anything but government schools. I think there's
It's pretty
amazing
clear
private
from your
schools out
books, and
there.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
you
yeah.
explain why. Yeah.
I wear that
So,
on my sleeve. I'm not
yeah.
shy about that at all.
Yeah, I
In
was not
fact,
aware. I was not aware of the
go ahead.
whole history of Dewey and how you explain all that. That was really shocking to read
Yeah.
that in your books. Yeah.
Yeah, the problem I would say I have with a lot of people is they don't really know their history. They don't know
Hmm.
how these institutions started. They don't know what the goals were of the people who started them. And so, if we understand our history, I think we can better plan for our future. But many parents are just like, "Oh, I went to public school. I turned out fine, so it'll be okay for my kids." I believe that the good teachers, I mean, this happens in a variety of industries. Think law enforcement. I think a lot of good cops leave the profession, both because of the pay and lack of public support or whatever. And so you end up with people in the profession who might not be the best ones that to be engaging with the public. I think the same trend happens in government schools. I think the better teachers leave for better opportunities, starting their own businesses, starting a micro school. I know many public school teachers who say, I homeschool my kids. I won't send them to the very place that I work. And they're looking for the exits, trying to figure out what their next career move is. And this is a trend. So it again leaves behind the types of people who see the classroom as a platform upon which to advance their activism and their kind of ideological indoctrination in a way. And those aren't the best teachers that I think most parents would want for their kids. So to me, it really boils down to one word, and that is intentionality.
Hmm.
If you are sending your kids to a government school or a private school or whatever, as long as you're very intentional, your kids will turn out fine. If you're reviewing what they're learning, if you're challenging what the teacher said, if you're engaged, if you're being intentional, things will work out. But the same thing with homeschooling. You could just sit your kid in front of curriculum and let them go and
Right.
not really support them. Intentionality is the key. So that's my call for parents is let's just lean into this a little bit. Stop delegating everything to the schools. Stop outsourcing your parental responsibility. We are in what I consider to be a mind war, a war on truth. I believe
Hmm.
that our children's minds are ground zero for the conflict. And if we as parents are not intentional in understanding this reality that we are in, this psychological warfare, our children will become a casualty because we are not equipping them with body armor, a shield, a
Hmm.
weapon to defend themselves. We need to be intentional. We need to be aware of these forces swirling around in our society. And to that end, with Tuttle Twins and other things, we're trying to get out there and wake parents up, you might say, to the reality of what's going on so that they can better be intentional with their children and help them understand and embrace truth in a world that's full of lies.
Yeah, this reminds me of a book by Dr. Thomas Sowell, who's at the Hoover Institute at Stanford. He's written a number of wonderful books. I'm sure you're aware of them. One of them is called
Oh, yes.
Intellectuals and Race. And in there, he talks about how Black families actually were lower in divorce. They actually were very dominant in the South in terms of the construction industry. And the creation of this welfare state made it more, frankly, profitable for a single mom to be on welfare than to have a father in the home with low paying jobs. And Dr. Soul proves, I think, with very persuasive economic data, hard data, that there's a direct connection between fatherlessness, as you mentioned, not just in the Black community, but especially acutely in the Black community, and all of these other social harms. In terms of them being, overrepresented in the prison populations, economic disparities, and all of these other things. So there's a lot to be said for a smaller government. I think it was Milton Friedman who said, the bigger the government, the smaller the individual. And
Yeah.
I guess that's part of what you're saying with Libertas, and also in your books, right?
It is. In fact, I think that's a good opportunity to speak briefly about a brand new book that I have
Oh,
that
great.
just came out that's on this exact issue. So this is called Children of the Collective. This whole book, Children of the Collective, it's basically a book-length treatment of a single quote. In fact, probably in one of the books of mine that you've read, I shared this quote before, and it stuck with me for years in the back of my head that this quote is so powerful a descriptor, better, I think, than Friedman's quote, in describing the threat of the state to the individual. So this was a quote by Michael Novak,
Right.
and he's a theologian,
Hmm.
writer, prolific, written as many books as I have, probably more. So here's his quote. He says, "Between the omnipotent state and the naked individual looms the first line of resistance against totalitarianism, the
Right.
economically and politically independent family, protecting the
Hmm.
space within which free and independent individuals may receive the necessary years of nurture." So
Hmm.
he's positioning the family as the mediating institution between the omnipotent state and the theoretically naked, spiritually naked, socially naked, intellectually naked individual, and that the family needs to be the institution that basically nurtures the children and turns them into the first line of resistance against totalitarianism, which
Right.
means that as we have broken families, as you and I have been discussing just recently, as we have families weakened, therefore the individual is not shielded because the family is not economically and politically independent. And by extension, then they become dependent upon the state for all of its various programs and school and welfare and all the rest. And so we become an atomized society, not a society of social fabric where we're all interconnected in what Alexis de Tocqueville called mediating institutions,
Right. Yes.
where we're all helping one another. That's
Hmm.
this interconnectedness of society. Instead, with the family weekend, we become atomized, each atom
Hmm.
breaking off from its kind of atomic chains, and we have a direct relationship instead with the state. And
Right.
so instead of this cohesive social fabric, we have this one-to-one relationship, everyone with the state. So it grows in power and size and scope because it has to fulfill all those demands. And pretty soon we're left with weak families, weak individuals, and society in tatters. And so, anyways, that's kind of the focus of the book, is to take that quote and say, let's dig in deep to this quote and understand, why are individuals naked? How is the state omnipotent? Why is the family the first line of resistance? And more specifically, what can I as a mom or dad do to protect my kids, to be that
Hmm.
first line of resistance? So the book
Hmm.
has some very kind of actionable ideas of what parents can consider in order to better protect their kids and have a strong family.
Let's talk a little bit about a book that you wrote about 10 years ago called Feardom, which I really enjoyed way before its time, actually, because it actually foresaw a lot of the things that we were now living through, including COVID, and how despots weaponize fear to control individuals and to control us politically and emotionally. So you want to talk a little bit about that book, and how you sort of saw this stuff coming, 10 years ago. I was kind of shocked when I saw it was written and released in 2014.
Yeah, no, thank you. That book I was sad to write, in the sense that I felt like the ideas it contains are always going to be relevant, because I'm not going to claim I had the ability to foresee anything. If anything, the book is really focused on the war on terror in a post
Yeah.
9/11 world, talking about how we were scared into supporting this massive government, this massive military
Hmm.
empire, and the Patriot Act and the TSA and all the rest.
Right.
And so it was more of a reactionary book, seeing now what we had been living through. But then identifying the trend that happened in decades and centuries before even that. And then, of course, that trend continues today with many things, including COVID. We like to think of ourselves, especially those of us who care about freedom and we're kind of intellectual or independent minded or whatever, we like to think of ourselves as logical creatures.
Right.
We are not logical creatures. Humans are not logical creatures. They are psychological creatures, which means that our brains and the way our information is processed in our minds is deeply affected by sociocultural and emotional and even medical type of things going on. And so the sad reality is that there are many people, you call them propagandists or politicians or pundits or whoever, that understand the way the human mind works. They
Hmm.
understand the way to persuade people, to scare them into submission. It's the reason why governments throughout history have operated what are called false flag events. Because if they can make someone scared and let this bad thing happen, then they're more likely to go support war, and that's always good for the sitting president to look like you're the one rallying the troops. So
Hmm.
that's what the book Feardom is about. And again, when I published it, I was happy that it was so relevant a book to be able to
Right.
sell a lot of copies, inform a lot of people. But I was also sad that that book will never not be relevant, because
Yeah.
these things, weaponization of our fear, continues to happen
Yeah.
today, and far into the future it will.
I think you quote in that book H.L. Mencken, this famous quotation about how governments have a vested interest in continuing to manufacture emergency after emergency.
That's right.
It almost sounds, Connor, as though your newest book sort of picks up the thread of feardom a little bit,
It
maybe
does.
in the aftermath of things like COVID and vaccine mandates and so on. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I don't directly connect the two, but I think it is fair to say that the one is an outgrowth of the other.
Right.
That as we see why, as a society, that we're so willing to give into the collectivists and their plans of state dominance and so forth, it all centers around this desire to be safe. It was Benjamin Franklin who, once quipped that those who desire or
Mm.
prioritize safety over liberty will have neither. They'll lose both and deserve neither of them, because in the quest for safety, I mean, we could be kept safe if we were all wrapped in bubble wrap all the time and not allowed to leave our homes, and but that's not a life worth living. Or during COVID, right? The fact that old folks would be trapped in these buildings and not allowed to leave, or their family
Yeah.
couldn't visit.
Yeah.
They'd have to wave through the window down into the parking
Yeah.
lot. Like at some point, I think life has to be lived despite risks that are involved. And do we really want to tolerate a society in which we are all kept safe? Because if it can save just one life, right, there has to be a trade-off, there has to be a
Yeah.
balance. So in Children of the
Right.
Collective, the idea of the book is to tell parents, like, hey, let's be bold in advancing freedom, protecting our kids, pushing back on the state. Yes, it'll be risky. Yes, it'll be an adventure. It's not going to be tame and easy, but life wasn't meant to be. So let's lean into
No.
it.
Well, and of course, the creator of life, just sort of by way of segue, would say that, of course, a meaningful life is not a safe one. Certainly, that's not the way our Lord lived. That wasn't his ministry. That's not his message. And so, the last book I want to talk to you about, which was really, I felt quite unique. I've never read a book like this Christ versus Caesar. And Caesar, I should say, for those who haven't read it, it's not necessarily about Rome. Caesar is basically a euphemism, a catch-all term for the state. This book is really important in the context of something that we are losing in the West, both in the United States and Canada, is the idea of the rule of law and its importance. Because with the exaltation of the state above the individual, and even above God, we're losing the rule of law. Because how can our rulers conform to the rule of law if they're not prepared to acknowledge that there's a higher power, and this idea of the need to have, in order to have a free society, you really need to have God at the head of the state. Would you agree with that sort of summary or assessment of the book?
I might go one step further.
Okay.
Beyond the rule of law, I would say yes, we have an attack on the rule of law and undermining of the rule of law, but I think that could also be argued in a way that it is a symptom of what's really going on underlying that. And I think that we have a war on truth. We have a
Oh,
war
yes.
on objective reality,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Because having a rule of law is predicated on the foundation of a set of shared ideals and understanding about the way the world works and what's actually happening. But if we lose that foundation of, what is right and what is good and what is wrong and what is true, if we can't agree as individuals, right now they have this sinister idea of you speak your truth, I'll
Yes.
speak mine, right? What's
Right.
good for you, whatever. And so we move away as a society from having these moorings of, objective truths that we all understand, that we've all taken for granted as objective truths. And now here we are in a crazy society where we're undermining those very foundations, and people want to turn it into subjective morality, subjective truth. It's however you interpret it. It's whatever you want it to be. So in my mind, that is the real war. It's a war for truth. It's a war for objective reality. And in the book Christ versus Caesar, really the whole book stems from this one question I had for myself, and that is, if we as Christians were to actually follow all of Christ's commandments, what would that look like? Again, going back to our religious freedom discussion, I don't think
Right.
religious freedom is just about belief, it's about action.
Right.
So if we as Christians modified all of our actions to be perfectly consistent with Christ's counsel and not make these little exceptions, or ignore that one or don't pay attention to that one, right? If we were to, again, no man can serve two masters, or when he says render unto Caesar, that which is
Yes.
Caesar's. Well, what is
Romans
Caesar?
13. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. What is Caesar's and what is, not? And so we have to understand, was he saying that follow the law, do whatever you're told, and just submit to whatever the civil government says? Or is there something more nuanced there to say, Caesar doesn't actually own anything. He's a counterfeit God
Right.
serving, Satan. And if we're really followers of Christ, to whom all, things belong and are subject to, then we're to render everything unto God and nothing unto Caesar. And we need to rebalance this idea that we shouldn't be good citizens. We should be good followers of Christ. And sometimes that means we'll be bad citizens. Sometimes
Right.
that means we'll break some of Caesar's laws because our focus and priority is being good servants of the true King.
Connor, just thank you so much for being with us and being our special
You're welcome.
guest today on Gray Matter.
Thank you.
God bless you and all that you're doing to help people. Really, it's wonderful. Thank
I
you.
appreciate it. Thank you very much.